In this video, we're going to look at the role that slavery played in the early years of the American Republic. At the Constitutional Convention, there was a dividing line between slave states and free states, each of them wanting different things. In particular, the slave states wanted to ensure that any new government, any constitution, would have a built-in structural advantage for them so that it would not be possible for northern states or free states more generally to ban slavery. And so that advantage was preserved through things like the Senate based on equal representation, the 3/5 clause that overrepresented southern states in the House, and the Electoral College formula that was based on both of those things. So all of those working together would ensure that the slave states had a relative advantage compared to their population. Now, in the early years of the Republic, slave states did have a numerical advantage. However, they knew that that wouldn't last. Within a few years, slavery was abolished in New York, and many of the American territories started to get admitted as states. And a territory basically was property of the federal government that soon would likely become a state if the people there organized and they asked Congress to admit them as states. And so there was a general feeling of whether that territory would want to come in as a slave state or a free state. Well, with New York and the other states that were admitted, that numerical advantage of the slave states was starting to erode. We were getting close to parity with 9 slave states, 8 free states, and some other territories that would soon want admission. In 1820, there was a compromise. Maine wanted to split from Massachusetts and become a state. However, that would have upset the delicate balance, and the slave states, southern states, were not going to abide by that. So the compromise was, yeah, sure, we will vote for Maine's admission as a free state if we can also have a slave state to balance. And so that was the compromise, known as the Missouri Compromise. Maine could come in as a free state, Missouri would come in as a slave state, but then we would draw a line. And that would be the line that demarked future slave states versus free states. Any slave that was admitted to the Union above the line would be a free state. Any state admitted to the Union below the line would become a slave state. And that took away any ambiguity and sort of reduced the potential for future conflict. Or so they thought. When Wisconsin came in, and then California wanted to come in 1850. That was a lot of new free states poised to join the Union. And so that precipitated another compromise. The free states were about to outnumber the slave states. So part of the negotiation was California can come in as a free state. Nebraska can come in as a free state, but we will leave Kansas and any other new territories to popular sovereignty. And what does popular sovereignty mean? It basically means that the people there can pick whether they want to be a slave state or a free state. Now this had the effect of undoing the earlier compromise, the Missouri Compromise. So this reflected a new status quo. Popular sovereignty means any new state can figure out what they want to be, if they want to be a free state or a slave state. Now, things started to get weird around this time. The Compromise of 1850, part of that compromise was a strengthening of the Fugitive Slave Act. With more free states coming into the Union and popular sovereignty being employed, there was concern in the South that slaves would try to escape and gain their freedom by joining a free state and getting their citizenship. And they didn't want that to happen. So there was a strengthening of the Fugitive Slave Act that required slaves to be repatriated back to their owners. This also coincided with what's called the Bleeding Kansas period. If popular sovereignty is going to be left to the states, like Kansas, if the people there can vote on whether they want to be a slave state or a free state, when do they vote? If 3 people get to Kansas, is that enough to hold a vote? What about 3,000? What about 30,000? At what point should you say, okay, now we'll stop and have a vote? And so what was driving this Bleeding Kansas period was different factions of free soilers that wanted to be a free state, people from the South that wanted to be a slave state, and they actually got quite violent, fighting each other to determine the eventual future of Kansas and their status as a free state or a slave state. Around this time in the American Senate, Charles Sumner, a senator, was giving a speech where he was suggesting that slavery should not be legal anymore. And a Southern senator, Preston Brooks of South Carolina, organized with some of his fellow senators to beat Sumner almost to death with a cane on the Senate floor. Why? Because he mentioned the idea that slavery maybe should be illegal someday. This really reorganized the party system. Some Northern Democrats, some disaffected Whigs joined and formed a new political party called the Republican Party. And their platform was to eventually do away with slavery. Of course, we're liberal Republicans and more moderate ones, but that was the general trend. That led us right up to the beginning of the Civil War. Here's the timeline here. On November 6th, 1860, President Abraham Lincoln was elected. He was elected president on an anti-slavery platform. That was the idea. He was not in favor of slavery. So 3 days later, South Carolina said, we're leaving. 3 days of having a president that didn't like slavery was too much for the South. They had lost their numerical advantage in the House and the Senate, and now the presidency had shifted. So now they were looking at a government, in their mind, that was aligned against them, or at least aligned against slavery. They couldn't handle that. So South Carolina seceded, followed by a bunch of other states. Today, this process of adding new states is still controversial. The factions have modified slightly, but there's still very much a north-south divide, an urban-rural divide, and that balance in the Senate, due to the nature of the party system, is still pretty close. So adding a new state could really give the Republicans or the Democrats an advantage. District of Columbia, should DC be a state? What about Puerto Rico? Well, that is very contentious because the parties are looking at how they might vote. Will this be a likely Democratic state, or will that be a likely Republican state? And that is really proving controversial. So nothing has really changed. Admitting new states to the Union has always been really controversial, and it comes down to partisan balance. While slavery was the defining issue, the issues have changed, the parties have realigned, but it still comes down to balance in the Senate.